Okay, Chapter 13, America in the Cold War and the Civil Rights Years. This is after World War II and the Cold War begins. Remember, the Cold War is an ideological war between two countries, the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union wanted to spread communism, the United States wanted to spread democracy, and it's kind of like a popularity contest with the world after World War II. Now, Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, it's the Soviet Union and the satellite nations around it. And then you have the Iron Curtain, which is a division of Germany into West and East. Remember, the country itself was divided into West and East, and so was Berlin, the capital of Germany, which was located inside eastern part of Germany. Right? I know it's a little confusing, but that's the way it was divided. Now, when that happened, we have the Berlin airlift because Joseph Stalin had cut off all roads to the the western part of Berlin, which was the Democratic side and the United States side. The Soviets blockaded Berlin, the United States sent in supplies, and the Soviets ended the blockade, right? We sent food over on planes every 3 minutes. Attempts at containment, you have the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which gives aid to Greece and Turkey, just as long as they vowed to be against communism, so they wouldn't give in. The Marshall Plan of 1948 gave economic aid to reduce the appeal of communism, right? And that was created by George Marshall. The creation of NATO was an alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western European countries. And as a counterattack, the Warsaw Pact was created. It's a pact of the Soviet satellite nations, right? So NATO are your democratic countries. Warsaw Pact are your communist countries. Within the Cold War, you have the Korean War. Remember, we used different countries as pawns in the Cold War. The Korean War was one of them. It was a 3-year war from 1950 to 1953. The main cause was that communist North Korea invaded democratic South Korea. Highlights: the United States enters under the UN resolution to defend South Korea. It ends in a stalemate. Also, remember, during this time, you have the Truman-MacArthur controversy. Truman sends Douglas MacArthur, which was a World War II hero, into Korea. They land and they push back all the way to the Chinese border. Now, China, is a little on edge, and they decide to also invade. So they push us back all the way down into South Korea again. Ultimately, it becomes a stalemate. Now, Truman and MacArthur get into this controversy. The controversy is that MacArthur wants to invade and use nuclear weapons against China because they're communist as well. Truman does not. He wants to avoid the use of nuclear weapons as much as he can. They have this disagreement, and ultimately, MacArthur gets fired under Truman. Now, the arms and space race, you have massive retaliation. It's the reliance on nuclear weapons for defense, right? We really didn't build up our army. We just tried to get more atomic weapons, and the hydrogen bomb was also created. The hydrogen bomb was 10 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we just relied on that ultimately. Now, in 1957, Sputnik was the first unmanned satellite to go into orbit, and the Soviet Union sent that satellite into space. And it sets off the space race. So it freaks us out, and we feel that they are superior to us because they have sent, an unmanned satellite into space. And we start to improve our math and science. We emphasize math and science in our classrooms now because of that reason. And NASA is created. And then we ultimately get the first men on the moon in 1969. Now, the Cold War and American security, you have the House of Un-American Activities Commission. We were extremely paranoid. This was our second Red Scare. We are paranoid that the communism is going to spread into the United States. So the House of Un-American Activities Commission interviewed and blacklisted those who were associated with communism. And don't forget about the Hollywood 10, and these are the people in Hollywood that were associated or said to be associated with communism. Now, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg trials, they were accused of being Soviet spies. The Venona Papers actually proved that they were, but they didn't come out until the 1980s. And the last thing here is McCarthyism, which is false accusations of being communist by Senator Joseph McCarthy. All right, again, false accusations of being communist. He never had the proof, but he always said he had names. Now, the Truman and Eisenhower administrations from 1945 to 1960. Truman, of course, he is the president at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. He ordered executive order to desegregate the armed forces. So after World War II, the armed forces are now integrated. Okay. The Eisenhower Doctrine extended U.S. containment policy to the Middle East. The housing boom under Eisenhower, you have the GI Bill, which is going to give veterans loans for houses and actually help them with their education. You also have the Highway Interstate Commerce Act. With the Highway Interstate Act, what it does is it provides roads and highways to connect states together, and you're able to travel faster. And because now you have highways, you're able to move from the city out into the suburbs. So people start to live in these suburbs now. Okay, again, moved to suburbs by many Americans. In the 1950s is when you have, your drive-in movies, your drive-throughs, and the more use of vehicles. So you have an economic boom after World War II. Now we get into the civil rights movement. You have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It allowed separate but equal facilities. Now Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954 overturns that. It ends segregation in public schools, and of course they state that separate facilities are inherently unequal. We emphasize that during the year. Inherently unequal. By nature, it will be unequal, right? By nature, it is unequal. A couple of highlights from the civil rights movement. You have the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. You have a boycott on buses, and that's the Montgomery boycott of 1955. Then you have integration in Little Rock High School in 1957, the Little Rock Nine, after Brown versus Board of Education was passed, and it ends segregation in schools. The Little Rock Nine are 9 African American students who get sent to high school, and they have to be escorted because the governor is totally against this. Okay, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which totally ends literacy tests and poll taxes, sit-ins and freedom rights to get more and more people to vote, and the sit-ins are for equality. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. And of course, affirmative action, 1965. Affirmative action is the fact that they cannot discriminate against you because of your race. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolent civil disobedience. Keyword, civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience. You have the right to not follow a law if you feel it is unjust. Okay? Now, he explained this in his letter from a Birmingham jail, and it explained why African Americans could no longer wait for equality and also justified civil disobedience. And ultimately, his March on Washington was where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech, and it led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And a couple of key individuals, George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff for FDR, Secretary of State for Truman, creator of the Marshall Plan. Thurgood Marshall was the NAACP attorney, the first African American on Supreme Court. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, leads to the Montgomery bus boycott. And the last 3 people, George Wallace, Orville Faubus, and Lester Maddox, these were your Southern governors resisting integration. All right, all they wanted to do was to maintain the status quo. Status quo means that you want to keep things the way they were. You don't want to go against tradition. So these 3 guys did not want integration because that's not how they were raised, I guess you can say. So George Wallace, Orville Faubus, Lester Maddox, Southern governors resisting integration. If you have any questions, you let me know.